What if each of the 7 deadly sins had a twisted toy form in Poppy Playtime? Turns out they do, and the way each character lines up with pride, greed, lust, and the rest, it's way too accurate to ignore. I've pieced it all together using ARGs, game files, and buried lore you've probably missed. So let's start at the top with pride. The sin that drives people to be self-centered, taking credit for things they may not entirely deserve. And I think we can all agree, the Doctor, Harley Sawyer, fits this perfectly. In Chapter 4, he proudly claimed sole credit for discovering the elusive Golden Path, but a document from the Chapter 3 ARG clearly states that all the Playtime Co.'s scientists contributed to the breakthrough. And speaking of ARGs, the most recent one features the Doctor boasting that he's never needed help from anyone, even going so far as to speak about himself as if he were an almighty god. There are actually many examples from the Chapter 4 ARG of the Doctor acting extremely egocentric, so many that there's not even time to show them all. And of course, the Doctor would insist that all of his work was for the betterment of humanity, despite the fact that he was removed from the Young Geniuses program by Elliot Ludwig, specifically due to his lack of humility. To him, nothing mattered more than making progress, no matter the cost. But the Doctor disregarded everything that Ludwig said and took his removal from the program as a personal attack. Another telling detail is that the Doctor partially credited himself for Playtime Co.'s development, even though, at the time, he had only been working at the factory for a few months.
When I look at this company we've built, I do not feel proud.
Taking all of this into account, it's clear that the Doctor's defining sin is pride. One of his creations, though, Mommy Longlegs, may best represent greed. The sin marked by an intense desire for something that often drives destructive or unlikable behavior. In just the first few minutes on screen, she threatened to eat us alive, then forced us to play through a series of traumatizing minigames. It's clear Mommy craved revenge, even going so far as to kill any toys that failed to take us down, showing just how desperate she was to get what she wanted. She recognized the player as a former employee, and it's well known that while the factory was still running, she was openly hostile towards the staff. This was her revenge, a way to psychologically torment us before ultimately trying to finish us off, and at the heart of it all was her greed, driving her every move. However, Miss Delight might be an even stronger candidate for this sin. After all, she killed and ate her sisters after they were locked inside Playcare's schoolhouse. Now, sure, they were clearly starving, but instead of trying to find a way out, she resorted to literal cannibalism. That might even explain her hostility towards us in Chapter 3. She may have just wanted another snack. It was obviously a desperate situation for the teachers, but survival could have been approached with a far less horrific solution. And yet, the prototype had no issues with this behavior. If anything, he encouraged it, allowing the toys to turn on each other after the hour of joy. This is just one of the many reasons he perfectly embodies the sin of wrath, where someone's anger drives them to abandon all sense of morality and act with complete recklessness. Even in the earliest stages of its existence, the prototype proved himself to be an unrelenting and merciless force.
The prototype attempted to escape through the open door. However, another surveillance specialist was able to remotely relock the door, despite the other specialists still being inside. One casualty occurred.
Despite this, the prototype wasn't always entirely selfish. In fact, there was a moment where he acted with surprising selflessness, sacrificing his own freedom to save an injured orphan. That very child would later become Catnap, and when we consider how Catnap's life ultimately ended, along with who was responsible for it, it does cast the prototype in a very different light. But this darker side of him is most evident in the Hour of Joy, an event he personally orchestrated. There's evidence to suggest that his intentions weren't entirely malicious, as he may have been trying to free the orphans from their gruesome fates as test subjects. However, it's important to remember that the vast majority of Playtime Co. employees were completely unaware of the company's horrible secrets. The prototype was obviously aware of this given his intelligence.
So, I took a peek beneath the gate, and some massive bloody thing was doddering about the bloody hallway.
Thing? You're sure it wasn't a person?
Ain't no person that's 50 feet long with 1,000 legs.
Hundreds upon hundreds of innocent lives were lost on that fateful day, the day of the Hour of Joy, and even more were taken when the prototype ruthlessly destroyed the safe haven in Chapter 4. Death clearly doesn't bother him. He's more than willing to use the corpses of fallen toys for his own secret project. It's hard to believe he ever cared about the orphans at all. He may have even been the one who attacked Kissy Missy simply for siding with us. There's no denying it now, the prototype is a cruel and cold-hearted specimen. But the same might not be true for Huggy Wuggy, who best represents envy, the sin rooted in resentment and jealousy toward those who have something you don't. Admittedly, no character in Poppy Playtime fits this sin perfectly, but when we take a closer look at Huggy's behavior, he seems to be the strongest candidate. One thing is clear, he longed for freedom. You could even say he was envious of those who had it. That's why, despite his supposed obedience, he broke out of the factory on a spring night in 1992. According to the 12 Days of Playtime marketing campaign, his so-called obedience wasn't obedience at all, it was patience. During his time outside, Huggy brutally devoured a deer, possibly as an act of reclaiming his freedom to prove that he could survive on his own without being a slave to the factory's twisted scientists. And perhaps that same longing for freedom is what led him to attack us in Chapter 1. After all, we had something he never did, because under the prototype's rule, no toy was allowed to leave. They were doomed to wander the eerie halls of Playtime Co. for the rest of their existence. This didn't seem to bother Catnap though. If an order came through from the prototype, he would obey, no questions asked. His devotion came from a deep craving for the prototype's attention, even going so far as to build an entire shrine to worship the experiment. So, it should be pretty clear why Catnap represents lust, the sin defined by a desperate, consuming desire. Just look at what he did to poor Dog Day, tearing off his legs simply because he refused to support a massacre the prototype was responsible for. One that claimed countless innocent lives. And, of course, in Chapter 3, Catnap was relentless in his pursuit of us, all because the prototype commanded it. To him, the prototype wasn't just a leader, he was the god of the factory, a flawless being incapable of wrongdoing. Next up, we have Boxy Boo, who embodies gluttony, the sin of an insatiable appetite. In fact, that description almost perfectly matches how he's portrayed in the 12 Days of Playtime post. Nearly every time we've seen this monstrous jack-in-the-box, he's been eating something or someone. Whether it's a resource extraction specialist, Rowan Stoll, or just some unlucky employee, Boxy is always consuming. But this habit didn't just appear out of nowhere.
We need to start tailoring that appetite of yours to flesh.
The doctor trained Boxy to thrive on human flesh, and given what we know, it's likely that as part of this training, he was encouraged to eat as much as possible. His role, after all, was to dispose of any troublesome employees. So, what has all of this been building toward? Well, the final sin is sloth. This one's a bit more complex than the others, but it typically represents someone unwilling to put in effort or recognize the consequences of their actions, someone who shows little concern for others. And the toy that fits this sin best is none other than the main character, the title character, Poppy herself. She's been unwavering in her mission to destroy the factory, even when faced with Doughy the Doman's objections. He didn't think it was right for everyone in the factory to die just to bring down the prototype, but Poppy? She didn't even seem to consider that possibility. Right after we returned from taking down the doctor, she ordered us to head straight to the Foundation and plant explosives as part of her grand plan, and let's not forget, Poppy was captured by the prototype after the Hour of Joy, though honestly, that could have been avoided given the size of the Safe Haven team. To make matters worse, Poppy abandoned us and Kissy Missy near the end of Chapter 4 simply because things hadn't gone according to plan. That in itself was bad enough, but it gets even worse when you remember how Poppy deceived us back in Chapter 2. She promised we could leave the factory, only to betray us at the last moment and use us for her own agenda. When you look at it all, Poppy really does come across as the most slothful character in Poppy Playtime. Do you agree with all these comparisons? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Also, subscribe if you love your mom.